So we previously talked about conditionals. Conditionals are if-then statements. So our original conditional was if P, then Q. Then we talked about a converse statement. A converse was Q, then P, where you're going to change the order of your sentence, change the order of your conditional by switching the order of the hypothesis and the conclusion. Okay, remember the hypothesis is the P and the conclusion is the Q. Now, today we're going to add two more, okay? So the next one we're going to talk about is called the inverse. The inverse are in the same order as the original conditional, but you're going to negate them. So you're going to add the word not or take the not away, okay? We're dealing with plus and minus. So if it's a negative feel, you're saying you're not something, then to negate that, you would say you are something. If you say that you are something, then to negate it, you would say you are not something. Okay, so our inverse, actually, let's come down here and we'll add this to our table. So our converse was Q, then P. And we would read it if Q, then P. That's how you would read it. Then our inverse is going to be, it's going to be in the same order as the conditional, but it's going to be negated. And we use this little symbol right here for negate, okay? So when I say the word negate, the symbol for that is that little tilde, okay? So it's not P, then not Q, okay? So if not P, then not Q. Then the last one we have is called a contrapositive. So we have conditionals, we have converses, we have inverses, and then we have contrapositives. A contrapositives are in the same, or in the opposite order. They're switched, they're in the opposite order of the original conditional, and they're negated. So you start with your original statement, if then, if this, then that. Then the converse switches them. The inverse keeps them in the same order, but it negates them. And then the contrapositive does both. It switches them and negates them. So it would be if not Q, then not P. If not Q, then not P. That's how you would read that, not P. Okay? Now, here's just a kind of a helpful hint because we're going to talk about truth values. Here's the thing that you might want to remember is converses and inverses have the same truth values, and conditionals and contrapositives have the same truth values. Now, the reason that that is useful is because sometimes it's hard to tell with an inverse or a contrapositive whether it's true or false. Because when you put nots in there, it's hard to know how to answer. When you say it is not something or it's not something, then it gets confusing. And so I think it's just easier to find the truth value of the conditional and converse and then remember which ones go together. So let's practice writing a couple of statements and converting them into our other conditional statements. So we have our conditional. If two angles are vertical, so here is my hypothesis, that's the P, okay, then the angles are congruent. That is my Q. That is the conclusion. Okay, so first let's decide if that is true. If two angles are vertical, I'm saying two angles are vertical angles. So then you ask yourself, are they congruent? Yes, they're congruent. That's how you can determine truth or false. Okay, so if two angles are vertical, then the angles are congruent. So let's do the converse. The converse of that, remember, is you switch the order. Okay, so we're going to switch first. So we have it, then we switch it. Okay, so if Q, then P. So we would say if the angles are congruent, you could say, or if two angles are congruent, they doesn't have to be word for word. Just get the idea. If the angles are congruent, then they are vertical. Okay, you can word it again. You can say if two angles are congruent, then they are vertical angles. You can say it several different ways. So let's determine whether it is true or false. So now read the statement as though the hypothesis is the truth. The angles are congruent. And then ask yourself the second part. Are they vertical? They are congruent. Are they vertical? Well, not necessarily. They could just be congruent. They could just be the same size. They don't have to be, they could be bisected. Remember, we talked about those. So they don't have to be vertical. I'm saying they are vertical. That's how this statement reads. And that is not true. Now remember that the inverse makes it positive or negative, okay? Same order, so it's not P, then not Q. So it's the same order as our conditional, which was P, then Q, but it's negated. So let's add not in there, and you may have to kind of finesse the words. Let's look at it. If two angles are not vertical, so that's how we would add that negation. If two angles are not vertical, okay, then our original statement said then the angles are congruent. Then we can say then the angles, and we need to negate it, are not congruent. Okay, now this is where you see it gets a little more complicated because it says if the two angles are not vertical. So now we have angles that are not vertical. So imagine just two random angles. Then they're not congruent. Well, you're saying then if they're not vertical, then they can't be congruent at all. And that's not true. Now, it may be hard for you to figure out whether that's true or false. Again, remember that your converse and your inverse have the same truth value. So the other one was much easier to determine. The angles are congruent, then they're vertical. That was much easier to determine. And so I immediately know then my inverse has to be false too. And then lastly, let's look at our contrapositive. So remember, it switches and changes, negates it, right? So it's not Q, then not P. So basically, the contrapositive switches the inverse, if you want to look at it that way, because the inverse negated it, and now we're going to switch it again. So we have it and we switch it, we negate it and we switch it. So now let's look at that. So if the angles are not congruent, remember you negate your original statement. So the original conclusion was the angles are congruent, so we're saying that the angles are not congruent. We're writing it first. Then the angles are not vertical. And see, it gets all kinds of complicated. Now they're not congruent. They're not congruent, they're not vertical. Well, that has to be true. They're not congruent. Well, if vertical angles have to be congruent, then if they're not congruent, then they must not be vertical angles. Amongst other things, they're not vertical angles. And so that is also true. Again, our conditional and our contrapositive have the same truth value, and our converse and our inverse have the same truth value. So notice the pattern. You have your conditional, P then Q. You switch them, Q then P, that's your converse. Okay, you go back to your original order and you negate them. Not P, not Q. Then you switch the order of that one. Not Q, not P. Okay, it'll kind of help you to see that pattern when you're writing them, so you don't have to think about it every time. Where does it go? What order is it supposed to be in? Okay, so try this one on your own. Maybe put me on pause for a minute and try it on your own. But let's look at this one. If it is not a weekday, then it is Saturday. So I'm going to read this so that I can determine my truth value. Remember, that's my P then Q, right? If it's not a weekday, then it is Saturday. That's my hypothesis, my conclusion. So I'm saying it's not a weekday. Is it Saturday? And we're saying it is Saturday. Well, it could be Sunday. So that's false, right? And our counterexample is it could be Sunday. Sunday's not a weekday either. So our converse, remember our converse, we're just going to switch the order that things are written in. Okay, if it is Saturday, then it is not a weekday. So we say, is that true? It's not, it is Saturday. It's Saturday, but it's not a weekday. Well, that's true. If it is Saturday, then it is definitely not a weekday. Okay, then our inverse. Remember now our inverse, right? We switched for our converse. We negate for our inverse. So then we go back to the original order. If not P, then not Q. So we go back to our original problem. If it's not a weekday, now we need to negate that. If it is a weekday, and then we need to negate our second part. The conclusion was then it is Saturday. We need to negate that. Okay, then it is not Saturday. And we can see that that's true. It's a weekday, so that means it's not Saturday. Okay, so we know that's true, and we knew it was true because the converse was true. And then our contrapositive does both. Okay, it takes the original statement, it negates it, and it switches it. Everything's based off the original statement, right? So we already negated it, and we already switched it. So let's take the inverse, and let's switch the order of the inverse. Okay, if it is not Saturday, then it is a weekday. Okay, it's not Saturday, so it must be a weekday. Well, no, it could be Sunday again. So then we've got that false. Okay, so let's break it back down. Remember, you have your conditional. Okay, your conditional was P then Q. Okay, to get the converse, we switch them, Q then P. To get the inverse, you go back to your original and you negate it. If it already says not, you remove not. If it doesn't say not, you add not. Okay, and then your contrapositive makes the original statement negative and it switches it. Or you can cheat kind of and look at your inverse and just switch the order of your inverse. So you have it, you switch it, you negate it, and then you switch it. Okay, that's kind of a way that you can